Welcome back to today's commentary program. If a nation, once the recipient of over 400 billion from the European Union for infrastructure development, agricultural reforms, and economic modernization, now plans to withdraw from that very union, should we call it ingratitude or an awakening? For more than 2 decades, Poland was arguably Europe's most pampered child. But when the EU faced its own decline, when the once generous mother began to suggest, perhaps it's time you contributed something back, Poland quietly began to slip away from the table. Meanwhile, across the continent in Moscow, a certain man remains silent, yet his eyes follow every move with a profound understanding. No need for attacks, no need for threats. Simply standing firm long enough will allow the opponent to collapse on their own accord. Dear viewers, what is truly unfolding behind the velvet curtains of European politics? Why would a nation that once thrived on EU funding choose to make its exit just as Brussels faces its most dire circumstances? And what implications will this have for Ukraine, for Russia, and for the entire European landscape? Stay with us, because what you are about to witness may fundamentally alter your perception of Europe and Russia. Poland in the early 2000s. If you were to pass through at that time, it wouldn't leave much of an impression. Somber fields stretching into the distance, dilapidated factories from the Soviet era, bumpy roads, and antiquated towns seemingly forgotten by time. But then, in 2004, a miracle occurred. Poland joined the European Union, and from that moment, its history was rewritten with money, a great deal of money. Over $430 billion in EU aid began to flow in. Modern highways stretched across the country, new bridges spanned the Vistula River, and airports sprung up. Great towns were suddenly revitalized, as if a time machine had propelled this Eastern European nation forward 20 years in less than a decade. Polish farmers weren't left behind either. Agricultural subsidies, a gift of a scale Brussels had never been so generous with, transformed small plots of land into industrial-scale farms. Hand-pulled plows were replaced with modern machinery, and cooperatives flourished. In policy conferences, Poland was no longer seen as a newly integrated nation, but began to be hailed as a model Eastern European success story. But the most significant aspect wasn't the money. It was the intangible trust that Europeans once placed in Poland. Affectionately, they called Poland their virtuous eldest child, the one destined to grow up successful and give back to the family. A nation once submerged in the darkness of Soviet communism was now expected to become a symbol of successful Europeanization. Europe believed in it wholeheartedly. Brussels poured money in without hesitation. European commissioners would say in closed-door meetings, "We will never regret investing in Poland." And indeed, for a long time, no one doubted it. Not the EU, not the Polish people, and not even nations watching from the outside, like Russia. Because at the time, it seemed everyone believed in a true fairy tale, that by working together, every child could grow up to be kind, grateful, and successful. But there was one thing that no one noticed, or perhaps intentionally ignored. When you nurture someone too quickly, too easily, you don't just give them strength. You also grant them the option to turn their back. And that option is precisely what Poland is now preparing to exercise. When you are invited to a feast, amidst the sparkling lights of European glamour, wine flows freely. Music echoes from Paris, bread is fragrant from Berlin, and premium cured meats are served from Madrid. Everyone laughs, everyone raises their glasses, and everyone thinks this party will last forever. But then, one cold morning, the host rises, their face no longer as cheerful as before. In a low, hoarse voice, they announce that it's time for everyone to pitch in. And immediately, the room becomes eerily silent. That's precisely what's happening with Europe right now. Germany, the leading engine of the European Union, is slowing down. Manufacturing indicators have been declining for 6 consecutive quarters, businesses are closing, and consumer confidence has hit rock bottom. An economy once considered exemplary is now struggling to conceal the cracks spreading beneath its glossy veneer. France, on the other hand, isn't facing economic woes, but Its political heart is in disarray. Protests are sweeping across major cities, from Marseille to Paris, involving everyone from blue-collar workers to students. People are taking to the streets not just because of pensions or inflation, but because they feel a loss of control. They no longer know who is truly running the country. Brussels, the administrative heart of the EU, is panicking. They are beginning to ask members to share the burden, increase budget contributions, accept more refugees, and comply with new, more stringent green policies than ever before. A country like Germany, which once had a surplus to lend, is now demanding its share back. France, meanwhile, has no mental space to shoulder any additional burdens. Smaller countries like Slovakia, Hungary, or even Portugal can only exchange silent glances. Europe, a name that once represented prosperity and unity, is being undermined by its own long-held beliefs. Questions begin to surface in closed-door meetings. Do we still have the means to sustain each other? Or has the time come for every nation to fend for itself? Amidst this, Poland begins to sense that something is amiss. The party they once believed was a family gathering has turned into a lengthy bill, and the gazes directed at them are no longer as warm as before. Some say it's time to share, but Poland secretly thinks, I didn't sign up for this when I joined the party. Meanwhile, in Moscow, they remain silent. They don't need to say anything. Because after years of isolation, perhaps those who once joined hands are now dismantling the alliance themselves. And in this chess game, the one who doesn't move is the only one who avoids being harmed. Poland isn't withdrawing overnight. They aren't erupting in anger or slamming their fists on the table. But somewhere, in cabinet meetings, the atmosphere has gradually changed. In the past, they sat at the table with Brussels like a cherished child, always knowing they would be favored, always hearing words of encouragement. But now, instead, they see demanding looks, numbers, obligations, and reminders that it's time to contribute. A famous commentator in Warsaw once wrote, "We used to think the EU was our home, but now it's an ever-increasing utility bill." Awakening is never a pleasant feeling, especially when you realize that your dream for the past 20 years has been funded by someone else's money. It starts with small details. Agricultural subsidies are cut, environmental conditions become stricter, and loan packages require timely repayment instead of continued extensions. The Polish people begin to see the benefits diminishing while the responsibilities keep increasing. Those who once proudly proclaimed their country as a living testament to European success now quietly exchange glances, because no one wants to admit that the era of free handouts has ended. But it's not just a matter of finances, it's a matter of honor. Will Poland accept becoming a middle-aged nation within the European family, no longer pampered, no longer coddled, and above all, no longer prioritized? For many, the answer is no. From Warsaw to Krakow, discussions gradually shift from how much more can we receive to why do we still have to listen? This is no longer the attitude of a beggar. It's the mindset of someone who has risen, grown up, and begun to realize that if this party no longer serves their interests, leaving isn't necessarily betrayal. It might just be a sign of awakening. And for those observing from the outside, like in Moscow, they understand that this is a turning point for a nation. No one needs to instigate. Time and truth are enough, because a well-fed child will sleep soundly. But when it grows up and realizes it has to support the one who once nurtured it, everything begins to change. Once economic trust disappears, political affection follows suit. In Poland right now, that's no longer a maxim. It's a reality being written into every line of internal documents. They don't call it a divorce. They avoid using the term leaving the alliance. Instead, words like strategic reorientation, renegotiating fiscal commitments, or establishing a more flexible cooperation model begin to appear frequently in internal documents. But everyone understands that a scenario is being drafted, a scenario of withdrawal, not because Poland hates Europe, but because staying is an investment that no longer pays off. Poland isn't like the United Kingdom, where Brexit was the result of political discontent and a fading imperial dream. Poland is more pragmatic. They once loved Europe, were grateful, and embraced the dream of integration. But now, they are starting to calculate how many billions of dollars must be contributed to the union's budget each year. How much damage will each environmental mandate from Brussels inflict on domestic industries? How much of the domestic agricultural production is being restricted due to a nod from a supervisory body in Belgium? And, more importantly, they are calculating how much of their national identity remains after more than 20 years of integration. In the southern villages, the elderly whisper, "We speak more European than Polish." In the large schools, students begin to memorize the EU anthem but forget the ancient songs of traditional winter festivals. A nation that cannot control its identity will become a branch office rather than a country. And that's what Poland fears most. So they don't make a fuss, don't engage in destructive behavior like Brexit. They are quiet, tidy, cautious, and efficient. The scenario is being written as a smooth escape, pulling one foot out first and observing the reaction, then finding a way to withdraw the other foot. They propose renegotiating the level of contributions. They oppose mandatory immigration policies. They delay the implementation of green laws and, at the same time, strengthen bilateral trade cooperation outside the EU. This is no longer the attitude of a loyal member, but the behavior of someone testing the door handle and quietly considering the escape route. From Moscow, this story is viewed with experienced eyes because sometimes you don't need to topple a system. You just need to wait for it to loosen, link by link. And clearly, the link called Poland is emitting the first sounds of strain. Imagine a shared rental house, two friends renting together, eating together, living together, sharing the party for many years. The first person, whom the host calls Brussels, is polite, generous, and principled. The second, a guest who has stayed too long, is called Poland, enthusiastic, grateful, but calculating. For 20 years, Brussels has been the one going to the market, paying the electricity, water, and internet bills. Poland only needs to contribute a small part, and in return, they enjoy lavish dinners and endless fun in the shared kitchen. But then, one rainy day, Brussels opens the refrigerator and finds it empty, looks at the electricity bill and sees it soaring. And for the first time in many years, the host turns to their roommate and says, "Hey, could you help me pay a few bills this month?" Poland smiles, gets up from the table, and says they have an urgent call. The story may sound humorous, but it's a perfect metaphor for the relationship between the EU and Poland. At this point, Brussels has spent hundreds of billions of dollars, not out of naivety, but out of trust, believing that eventually this younger sibling would grow up, understand, and share the burden. But what they didn't anticipate is that when the fullest plate is placed in front of someone for too long, they will forget the price of each dish. Now, when Brussels needs help, Poland is the first to find an excuse to withdraw, not uttering bitter words, not openly protesting, just quietly standing up in every party. There will always be someone who leaves the table earliest, and that's usually the one who is full. Viewers will ask, is it unfair? Is it ungrateful? But from Poland's perspective, they think, I didn't sign a contract to wash the dishes. This story doesn't have clear villains, but it has an undeniable truth. When rights and obligations are no longer proportional, even a long-standing friendship can become an unannounced farewell. And in Moscow, no further explanation is needed because they are familiar with that kind of farewell. Silent, but real. Every step Poland takes away, the echo will reverberate all the way to Moscow, not because Russia is close, but because Europe is standing too close to the edge of the abyss. Imagine a domino table where Poland is no longer a single piece. It's the central pivot. And when that pivot falters, the entire structure will tilt without anyone pushing it. Hungary has long had a complex relationship with the EU. They have been punished by Brussels for legal issues, have refused mandatory immigration laws, and have openly admired Russia's way of controlling sovereignty. If Poland has the courage to leave, Hungary will be the first to applaud. Not because they hate the EU, but because they are being proven that, oh, it turns out you can escape. Next are the Czech Republic, then Slovakia. These are small countries, but there is always a simmering conflict between two streams. One is the dream of Europeanization, the other is the national instinct to maintain self-determination. And Poland, a larger, stronger country, once seen as a model, if it withdraws and still stands firm, will anyone still want to stay? The chain reaction doesn't happen in a week or a month, but it starts from the moment someone gets up without being punished. And when the dominoes start to fall, who is standing outside observing? Russia doesn't applaud, doesn't interfere, just quietly monitors. Because for years, they have been seen as the shadow outside the EU fence, a counterweight, a challenge, a name always mentioned with vigilance. But now, Russia doesn't do anything, just waits for Europe to collapse on its own, because soft power isn't in military strength. It's in patience, in not collapsing when others are crumbling. And strangely, Poland, the nation that once served as a shield against Russia from the West, is inadvertently opening a gap in that very wall. A gap not broken by tanks but by free choice. Because when a child decides to leave home, outsiders don't need to tempt them. They just need to open the door. When the opponent loses themselves, the steadfast suddenly become the wisest. Russia has been painted as an outsider for many years, standing outside the door of Europe, both scrutinized and isolated. Every news report from Brussels has used heavy, threatening, destabilizing, and restrained words for Russia. But, ironically, while Europe is increasingly confused, the one who was once seen as the problem is becoming proof of a simple truth. Steadfastness is the most luxurious thing in an era of volatility. Look back from the beginning. When the EU poured hundreds of billions of dollars to keep members close, Russia invested in internal strength despite the difficulties. When the EU forced countries to comply with green laws, regardless of cost, Russia maintained an independent energy policy. And when the entire European bloc argued about distributing immigrants, Russia didn't have to argue at all. Not because Russia is perfect, but because they didn't chase after the trends that caused Europe to stumble today. While the EU is running out of budget, the German economy is in recession, the French are protesting, and Poland is preparing to leave, Moscow doesn't need to act, they just need to stand still. That standing still isn't a silent resignation. It's the stance of someone who knows. If the storm is big enough, the tree doesn't need to attack anyone. Just not falling is enough to make others look back. And they have begun to look back. Nations that once turned their backs are quietly reconnecting gas pipelines. Agreements that were put aside are quietly returning to the negotiating table. No one calls it a turnaround, but everyone knows it's pragmatism. Russia doesn't need to win by declaration, because they are winning by reality. This whole world is a spinning chessboard. Whoever runs too fast will get dizzy. Whoever raises their head too early will be hit by the wind. But whoever knows how to bow their head and maintain their pace will be able to go far. Russia, after all, doesn't need to do much to prove itself. They just need to stand there and witness the ideals that were once praised fading away. And when Poland, the one who once led the dream of integration, withdraws, it's not just news, it's a silent confirmation. The one who was eliminated from the game years ago is now the only one sitting in their rightful seat. No one wants to be a borrower forever, even if the lender was once the best friend. That's not a reproach. It's the stark truth that Poland is facing. And the whole world, if still somewhat sensible, should look at it as a serious lesson. 20 years ago, aid was a life raft. But if after 20 years you still need a raft to float, either you haven't learned to swim, or you've forgotten that you could have swum on your own a long time ago. Poland is facing a major decision, not just because they feel unfairly treated by the EU, but because they are beginning to understand that no country can live on other people's money forever and still maintain self-respect. They look back at themselves. They have become more modern. They have modern highways, modern industrial zones, and iconic constructions that represent development. But then, they also see the downside. An economy closely tied to loan conditions. a budget overly dependent on external sources, a younger generation that is becoming accustomed to the concept of working for Europe rather than working for their country. And that's when Poland pauses, not to turn back, but to redefine what truly constitutes development. Because true development doesn't come from aid, it comes from the ability to live without it. The story of Poland is a wake-up call for countries that are relying too much on Western aid, the small countries that are even dreaming of integration as a magic ticket to change their fate. But no one tells them that the ticket comes with a bill, and that debt isn't just money, but also the right to decide their own destiny. Russia isn't a country that receives aid. Russia stood up on its own, sometimes in solitude, sometimes under pressure. But that's what taught them how to survive, without anyone's charity. And perhaps that's why Russia doesn't envy. They watch in silence as others receive more. Then, when those who receive the most begin to withdraw first, the lesson becomes undeniably clear. Freedom doesn't come from money. It comes from daring to stop accepting it. And Poland is teaching this to Europe again, with a decision that many will only fully understand in hindsight. Poland stands at a crossroads, not of geography, but of memory and future. Behind them lie 20 golden years filled with the feasts, the lights, and the hopes that the European Union once offered. But ahead lies a hazy path where the lights of Brussels don't shine. No one holds their hand, and only their own footsteps guide them, and they are contemplating this deeply, not with regret, but because for the first time in decades, they are forced to ask themselves, who are we if we are no longer the darling of Europe? When you've been loved too much for too long, self-determination can feel like emptiness. But it is precisely at that moment that you understand that freedom is never a comfortable feeling. It is a choice, a somewhat lonely one, but a necessary one. Poland isn't firing shots, declaring secession, or breaking down doors to run away. They are simply rising from the table, politely bowing and saying, I think it's time I went my own way. Withdrawal is sometimes not betrayal, but a nation reclaiming its right to self-determination. These words have echoed from many other countries, countries once considered different, misunderstood, troublemakers, until time proved that they were merely a step ahead. Russia was once ostracized, labeled an exception, and accused simply for not following the same path. But then, those who once held hands, who declared that nothing could divide them, are now themselves retreating from the game. History always has its own way of re-educating people. And this lesson is gentle but profound. Every empire, no matter how strong, must learn to let go. No one can hold another's heart with money. No one can buy loyalty with invoices, and no one can maintain a common home if every brick distrusts each other. Poland is leaving without haste, without resentment. They leave like an adult moving out of their parents' house, not out of hatred, but because it's time to live independently. If you think Poland is wrong, look back at how the world turned its back on those who nurtured it. And if you see somewhere in this story a reminder that national autonomy, self-reliance, and self-respect are never out of place, then perhaps you understand why the Russians have never felt the need to change their position on the world stage. Because sometimes the wisest person is the one who stays until the end without wavering. Yeah,